Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre wants to force a carbon tax election over the coming April 1st carbon tax hike. The House will vote on the Tories' non-confidence motion tomorrow. What's the strategy behind that election push? Let's bring in the front bench with us this evening. Saeed Selvam is the Vice President and Practice Lead of Public Affairs at National Public Relations. Former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Mar is with us. He's the President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Next to him, former interim NDP National Director Carl Bélanger. He's now the President of Traction Strategies. And next to Carl, that's Marika Walsh. She's a senior political reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Saeed, we're missing you here in studio. We've got everyone else here. Marika, I'll start with you. Look, we have literally talked about the carbon tax every day of the past month, or the price on carbon and the reason that it's going to increase on April 1st. The Tories have found a new way to keep the subject alive. How serious do you think this is tomorrow?
On the confidence vote?
Yes.
I mean, it's serious in the sense that who knows what happens, but it's not serious in the sense that we're quite sure it will pass. I mean, the Liberals are whipping the vote, and the NDP have shown time and again this week that they are tied hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder with the Liberals. So I would be very surprised to see it fall on this. The Bloc and the NDP have also both said they support carbon pricing. So I think overall, this is a pretty safe, still minority government, but the political risks for all these parties involved are very real.
Is there a risk for the Conservatives at all, Carl, to make this a non-confidence motion, or is it a solid strategic way to keep this in the headlines?
Yeah, it's theater, is what it is. It's easy to make that threat when you know that the vote's not going to pass. That said, I think they may want it to pass, but it's not going to happen. So, you know, it's all political games, and the main reason is to keep this on the forefront and make it like a very dramatic, confidence vote, government at risk of falling. And of course, some Liberal MPs could have the flu tomorrow and not show up, and you could end up with some weird results. But in all likelihood, we're still going to be here next week.
Although the Atlantic MPs, you know, I mean, I see why they're whipping it, because the Atlantic MPs, Gary, for the Liberals are not entirely united given the pressures they face in their own constituencies. What do you think of the strategy behind making this a vote of confidence?
I think it's a good strategy in the sense that I agree with everybody else that it's not going to change. We're not going to be in an election mode next week. But I think what it does do is it will reveal some of the schisms that exist within the Liberal Party, or perhaps even the New Democrats. I mean, New Democrats in Alberta are talking about, you know, distancing themselves from Jagmeet Singh over the issue of the carbon tax. You've got people like Bonnie Crombie, the head of the Liberal Party in Ontario, indicating that she doesn't support it. Consumer-based carbon tax. You've got 7 premiers who've said that they don't want it, including Premier Fury from Newfoundland and Labrador. So there is a lot at stake politically, even though it's not going to result in an election being called. The confidence motion will fail. But it's a good strategy on the part of the Conservatives, in my view.
I thought that exchange, Saeed, between the Prime Minister and Pierre Poilievre on this was so interesting, because it does make us think about how the past few elections, it has been a big issue. And at the outcome of those elections, the conclusion had kind of been, well, 2/3 of Canadians voted in favor of a party that supports the carbon price or the carbon tax, so the issue is settled. Lo and behold, it's anything but this time around.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that back and forth really spoke to a bit of the economics of the situation, with Poilievre talking about the fact that this carbon tax is actually going to increase costs for families, whereas the Prime Minister said, no, it's actually going to the families are not going to feel it as much once they get the rebate. So it was an interesting back and forth. But look, I think that this is a smart political play, especially by Poilievre, because he's able to position himself, as he's continuously done, as a champion of Canadians who are experiencing high costs. And as soon as you say tax, it's a 4-letter word, whether or not there's a rebate involved. So with something so somewhat unpopular with many Canadians across the country, it's a safe bet to keep this in the headlines by saying, I'm going to start talking about this. I'd like to bring up a motion of non-confidence. Whether or not it passes, it really doesn't matter, because, again, he positions himself really, really well and can possibly stand on this as an election platform if the hike proceeds as expected on April 1st.
Well, there will be, if the election is in the fall of next year, 2 hikes, actually, that Pierre Poilievre will be able to hold his election on. And it is interesting to see the Liberals kind of really double down, argue for it as passionately as they can, But to Saeed's point, like the rebate just doesn't punch through the same way the word tax does.
No. Once you're paying a tax, it's hard to understand how you're better off. That's the bottom line. I think it's very interesting to me, and we talked about this last week, that the Prime Minister's really made this about a legacy, about him thinking about the next generation, not his current voting patterns. And he's there defending the industrial carbon price and the consumer one. The Conservatives, while they talk about canceling the tax, axing the tax, have not actually said what they would do about the industrial carbon price. And Conservative premiers in different provinces have an industrial carbon price, some sort of alternative system. So, you know, this is really an interesting sort of dynamic where the Conservatives are making so much hay, getting so many victories over this, when it's actually the difference of something much smaller. And I'll be very curious to see if, when the Conservatives finally do release their climate plan, if there is an industrial carbon tax in it. My guess is there would be.
But on the consumer side, it's hard to see how they haven't won, Carl, the communications aspect of it. Because to Gary's point, it's the Alberta NDP, the Saskatchewan NDP. I interviewed Premier Houston, a Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia. It's his entire NDP and Liberal opposition that came together to put forward a resolution to call on the federal government to do this. Like Bonnie Crombie, you name, there's nobody left across any province beyond the federal government supporting this.
So they've lost the framing of this.
Yeah.
And we're talking about this as a money issue, which is not. It's supposed to be about pollution, about fighting climate change. That's not how it's being framed. That's not how it's being understood. And the rebate, you know, as was said, didn't punch through. So we're talking about money, financial constraints, people suffering, you know, having trouble to make ends meet. And so it's a lose-lose proposition for the Liberals, because if they remove it altogether, people won't see the difference. They won't feel the difference. But the perception is that they will make a difference. It won't, so it won't change their political fortune. And if they remove it, on the other hand, all the environmentalists that are still solidly behind the Liberals and the carbon tax, they're going to pull their support away. So what are they going to be left with? Not much.
I guess the calculation is, or the consideration is, that the faction of people who did support the Liberals in previous elections that allowed them to win, either majority or minority, are people who care a lot about the climate, Gary. And losing them would be more costly. Do you think that's an accurate consideration for the Liberals?
You know, I don't think so. I mean, I think that it's going to be a whole host of issues. This is just one of many. And, you know, as I've said before, at the outset in 2015, the Prime Minister had a lot of political capital and hasn't been able to take that wave of political capital and convert it into something that's going to be a durable public policy. I think the Conservatives recognize, I know talking to Scott Moe, you know, he has said, look, we want to keep the industrial carbon tax on because, you know, companies have invested, you know, billions of dollars into being prepared for it. And so I don't think that you're going to see the Conservatives make a change on that federally. But I think that, you know, Liberals who supported the, you know, the carbon tax, they certainly didn't support it because it was a wealth redistribution method, which I think is to Carl's point and what Minister Guilbeault has talked about, saying, you know, Canadians will be better off once they get their rebate. I mean, losses always loom larger than gains, and you are reminded every time you go to the gas pump on April 1st, the portion of the gasoline that you'll be paying for tax is going to be about 17.6%, or sorry, 17.6 cents per liter. Is what it'll go to. And, you know, a lot of people are looking at that and saying, goodness gracious, that's a lot of money. And they don't see the rebate quite as reminded of it every day.
Well, I think, Saeed, last word to you. I just have about 30 seconds. But that's why the framing of this has been so crucial, right? Because the industrial price on carbon, any additional price for corporations or industry does get passed down to consumers, but it's not in the naked way that this consumer carbon tax has been, and therefore, from a communications perspective, so much easier to oppose.
Exactly, and that's because, again, consumers are going to feel it the most. So whether you apply it on industry, whether you apply it on consumers, at the end of the day, it's the consumer that feels it. So the consumer is the voter, and the voter is, in many cases, opposed to anything that has to do with a tax. So this is something that I feel is going to be unpopular, especially, again, if it goes through April 1st as is expected.